Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear colleagues and students, I have a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Michael Walzer, Emeritus Professor of the Institute of Advanced Studies, Princeton, who has been awarded today honoris causa of the Belgrade University on ask of the Faculty of Political Sciences, and we are very proud.
So I'm very happy to be here and grateful for the honor that the university has conferred on me, and eager to join in your political discussions. I have all my life been involved in controversies, political, intellectual, philosophical, and I believe that controversies are central to the intellectual life of a free university and to the political life of a democratic society. And so I'm going to talk about a subject that is not easy for any of us, and that is the subject of how we live with difference. Diversity today is a universal condition. There's no such thing as a homogeneous country. A small number of cases grab the headlines: Hindus and Muslims in India, Sunnis and Shiites, Arabs and Kurds in Iraq, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, Jews and Arabs in Israel, Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. But in fact, every country in the world is divided in one way or another. Every community of citizens contains several alternative communities of faith and ethnicity. So what sorts of political structures can contain these differences? And I'm going to consider 5 possibilities within which members of these different communities have sometimes found safety and sometimes danger. Empires, multinational federations, binational federations, immigrant states, and nation states. That's not an exhaustive or exclusive classification. Many African states don't fit any of my categories, and some states, like India, fit more than one of them. Now, it's possible to imagine a purely political community where citizenship is the only basis of collective identity and all other social relationships are personal or familial. In such a community, there would be no minorities. Every man and woman would have the same standing vis-a-vis the political authorities. Everyone would feel equally at home. Constitutional loyalty would be the only loyalty. There would be economic differences among the citizens, but there would be no alien, outcast, or pariah groups. And some philosophers and some political theorists think that this would be the best possible political community. But it is a fantasy, and it's not my own fantasy. Citizens are never only citizens. They are always something else. They share a culture or a religious commitment or an ethnic or national history with some, but not all, of their fellows, and they attach great value to what they share. So it's with these other identities that I'm concerned today, with the rights of majorities and minorities, but also, more importantly perhaps, with the sheer survival and minimal well-being of the minorities, who are always at risk. How do different regimes cope with the heterogeneity of their citizens? How do they reduce or exacerbate the risks? I should stress that my subject is the coexistence of groups. And while repression is conceivably a form of coexistence, expulsion and genocide obviously are not. Those latter two represent final solutions to the problem of diversity, but they have no place in moral or political discourse. So first, empires. The multinational empire was the dominant political structure for most of human history. The classical city-state, the Greek city-state, was an aberration in the ancient world, and the nation-state is a modern novelty. Most men and women, most of the time, have lived under the domination of a distant center. The empires were multinational in three different senses. First, and most obviously, because they incorporated the territories and populations of many nations. Second, because they moved nations about for the sake of internal security, as in the biblical account of the Babylonian exile of the Jews, and so created new interminglings of diverse peoples. And third, because they facilitated the voluntary movement of individuals into the great capital cities, where all sorts of people mixed with one another. Imperial rule was commonly an unstable mixture of repression and tolerance. Repression of every national movement for independence, tolerance often for the multiplicity of cultures, religions, languages, and customary ways of life. Faced with the cruelties of modern nationalists, we may want to idealize the old empires, to emphasize the tolerance and forget the repression. But that's a mistake, because the conquests by which empires are established bring with them a human loss that is infinitely cruel. Think of Rome and Carthage, or Rome and Judea, or Spain and the Aztecs, or Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, and many different groups. And to maintain those conquests requires at least an intermittent cruelty, a reminder from time to time of imperial power. But it's also true that empires often established a kind of local peace, and that under the rule of their bureaucrats, people of different religious and ethnic groups lived side by side for generations without killing one another. Indeed, those bureaucrats were especially likely to extend their protection to the most vulnerable groups, the groups that stood most in need of protection and were most likely to be grateful for it. The nostalgia for empire is strongest among their members, the Chinese of Indonesia, the Asians of Uganda, and the Jews of Iraq were all better off in the old empires than in the successor states. Distance is the key to understanding imperial rule. Ideally, the bureaucrats come from far away, like Roman proconsuls in Egypt or British regents in India. They are indifferent to the quarrels of the nations they rule. They are without zeal in their repressiveness, amenable to corruption, and generally reluctant, as long as things are quiet, to interfere much in the everyday affairs of their subjects. The autonomy of the Ottoman millets is a typical imperial arrangement. It allows for a limited form of self-government within the homogeneous group, while the overall heterogeneity is controlled from outside. When that control fails, when distance disappears and the bureaucrats go home, group conflict begins. Then the crucial political question is, who among us shall rule over the others? Who shall rule right here in these villages and towns whose inhabitants suddenly realize or suddenly decide that they are different from one another? Now, multinational federations, the most obvious successor to the multinational empire, is a federation incorporating the same nations, reproducing the pluralism of the empire under the aegis of voluntarism. There aren't many examples. The former Yugoslavia is perhaps the most useful, a state whose parts were brought together by imperial rule, but which was redesigned by its founders as a free association. Why that association failed is something that you will have to explain to me. I'm not going to come from so far away and try to explain it to you. What it looked like from the outside was simply that the Yugoslav Federation was held together by the authoritarian rule of the Communist Party, and as that rule slowly collapsed, the Federation fell apart. But I'm sure there is a more complicated story to tell than that one. There are hardly any full-scale federations in the world today, Switzerland perhaps the most successful, but it's worth remembering that the idea once dominated socialist thought. Indeed, the impact of the old empires, Habsburg and Romanov, above all, on socialist thinkers, would be hard to overestimate. Here were practical examples of economic interdependence and political internationalism, and the idea of replacing the old empires with a multitude of nation-states, each with its own national bourgeoisie, each cultivating its own narrow parochialism, was abhorrent to socialists who had grown up in St. Petersburg, say, or in Vienna. And they were possibly not wrong to find that prospect abhorrent. It was only necessary, they thought, to destroy the autocracy, to democratize the central government and allow some degree of local autonomy, and the solidarity of the working class would sustain the unity of the empire against secessionist movements. The Soviet Union was a fraudulent version of this socialist model, an empire disguised as a federation. The attractive versions remain theoretical, as, for example, in the work of the Austrian socialists Otto Bauer and Karl Renner, who wanted to reconstitute the Habsburg Empire as a single territorial state and a series of non-territorial national corporations. Each constituent nation, whether its members were numerous or few, concentrated in a single region or widely dispersed, would have the right to organize a corporation and run its own educational and cultural institutions. Socialist federalism was the oppositionist version of imperial nostalgia. But Bauer and Renner underestimated the strength of nationalist feeling outside the imperial elites and the thin educated strata from which socialist intellectuals were recruited. Had they and their comrades come to power as successors of the Habsburgs, they would have had to reestablish the imperial pattern of cruelty and distance, as the Bolsheviks did, or they would have had to offer something more than local or corporate autonomy. For imperial coexistence had been, it turned out, a product of popular passivity. When the people were mobilized for the struggle against autocratic rule, they were also mobilized, perhaps unfortunately, for nationalist politics. Hence the great strains under which federations like the Yugoslav function, and hence the difficult constitutional issues that have surfaced in recent debates about federalism in Spain and the United Kingdom. We think of those latter two as the home countries of old empires, but in fact they are themselves mini empires incorporating several nations and moving under democratic pressure towards something like a federal structure. The purpose of the move in the eyes of its advocates is to enhance the power of minority groups like the Basques and the Catalans, the Welsh and the Scots, without breaking up the old union. Federalism is a stopping point between empire and national independence, and for all its difficulties, it's a very attractive stopping point, especially so perhaps for small nations that have lost some of the conventional attributes of nationality, like language, and have come to feel more or less at home in the imperial union. Over most of the world, however, federalism has not proven an effective substitute for full independence. Binational federations. I've separated out binationalism for one obvious reason, that it's frequently been proposed as a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also because of the troubles now being faced by the Belgian binational Commonwealth. I doubt that bringing two nations together is easier than bringing 3 or 4 or 5 together. The opposite is probably true. More nations in the federation make for a more diffuse conflict. In cases where two nations are intensely and antagonistically focused on each other, what reason could there be to tie the two into a single state? And yet, established federations like Belgium do endure with considerable political tension, but without murder and expulsion. Recently, at a discussion of the Belgian problems of Belgium, a Belgian philosopher suggested that what you need to make binationalism work is to start 500 years ago. And as the Walloons and the Flemish did. But it may also be the case that federalism is more successful when the two nations, as in Belgium, have their own relatively homogeneous territorial base. On the other hand, federalism may be more necessary when the two are radically entangled, as they are in Israel-Palestine. The Israeli settler movement aims to make a two-state solution impossible by increasing the entanglements, but presumably its militants have something else in mind than a binational state. Because conflicts in a binational state would be one-on-one without the possibility of shifting coalitions, numbers are critically important. Proposals for a Jewish-Arab federation in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s foundered on the question of immigration. Who was to determine the future members of the federation, and therefore the numerical strength of its two groups? The right to control immigration is a feature of sovereignty, but where does sovereignty reside in a binational state? The constitutional arrangements of such a state may be designed to evade that question, but sometimes it can't be evaded. Equally difficult is the question of minority vulnerability in cases where the federation includes a single majority nation and a single minority. Constitutional guarantees, a division of powers, a Bill of Rights might work in some cases, but they probably won't work if there's a long history of enmity and distrust. The breakup of Cyprus was driven in part by distrust. The Turkish minority felt that it needed the security of Turkey's sovereignty or of its own. It was not ready to count on the forbearance of the Greek majority, even if that forbearance was constitutionally entrenched. The key argument against binationalism in Israel today is the prediction by demographers that Jews will one day, fairly soon, be a minority in Greater Israel. That's obviously an argument made from a Jewish perspective, but it does suggest the value of a separate and sovereign state, which most Palestinians seem also to recognize, no doubt for their own reasons. The immigrant state, and I'll take my own country as the model here. America's citizens come from many nations. They have left their old territorial base behind and have not established a new one in their new country. Each nation lives dispersed among the others. Together, their members constitute a nation of nationalities, unitary in form, pluralist in content. Just how pluralist, however, is a matter of ongoing dispute. Two doctrines compete for dominance in immigrant states. The first pictures the state as a melting pot, a political structure within which a new nation is being formed, e pluribus unum, from many one. The nation of nationalities is, on this view, a temporary creation to be replaced eventually by a unitary nation-state. The second doctrine describes a permanent regime, multiculturalist in character, a union of groups as well as of individuals. Cultural pluralism strains toward a kind of corporate federalism, though this latter arrangement is not compatible in the United States with the individualism of the immigrants who came to their new country one by one and whose ethnic and religious communities are now voluntary associations. Nor is it compatible with the degree of melting or of cultural homogenization with which they have already made their peace. These two doctrines suggest some of the current and future difficulties of the immigrant state, but right now, the United States, in the eyes of many observers, including leftists highly critical of American capitalism and imperialism, right now the US looks like an ideal society. Heterogeneity without autocracy on the one hand, and without nationalist zeal on the other. I find it quite astonishing traveling in Europe, where I encounter many leftists who believe, first, that everything the United States does is wrong, and secondly, that all countries should be redesigned to look like the United States. The United States is a state of all its citizens, but this arrangement is founded in its own way on distance. Not the distance of the bureaucrat from the people he rules, but the distance of the people themselves from their ancient homelands. What else can account for one of the most remarkable features of American history? The fact that the original Anglo-American settlers, colonists, with whatever anxiety and resistance, with a lot of anxiety and resistance, allowed themselves to become a minority in what they surely thought was their own country. But it wasn't theirs in the same way that England had been. No people in their actual homeland would allow that to happen. So I must turn now to the political life of men and women who are not immigrants, who live where their ancestors lived before them, and who govern themselves by themselves. Nation states. Ideally, the nation state brings together all the members of a single national group and no one else. In fact, no actual nation state is quite like that. No nation state is at all like that. Migration and conquest have so mixed populations that it is impossible to draw a set of boundaries that encloses exactly the right people. What distinguishes the nation state is that the largest number of its citizens are members of a single nation, from which the state as a whole takes its character. All other citizens are members of minority groups, and they are unlikely to recognize themselves in the official history of the state or to feel their culture confirmed in its symbols and celebrations. In federations and immigrant states, politics is commonly a matter of shifting ethnic coalitions, but the politics of the nation state is dominated by a single group. That group will obviously have its own regional and socioeconomic divisions, its own class divisions. Nonetheless, it is singular and it is dominant. Stateless peoples seek that kind of dominance. Chiefly, I think, for defensive reasons. Think of the Armenians and the Jews. Minority groups are inevitably vulnerable in nation states, but it would be wrong to assume that they are inevitably ill-treated. Persecution and discrimination and expulsion and massacre are common enough in the history of nationalist politics, but the nation state is a setting for self-government which sometimes takes liberal and democratic forms. And when it does, a number of options open for the minorities. First, they are invited to assimilate into the majority, as so many minorities have assimilated, for example, into the French majority, to adopt its culture, identify with its history, and raise children indistinguishable from its own children. There's a loss here of collective identity, and as assimilation proceeds, of collective memory. but also a real gain, full participation in national culture and politics. Given the loss, however, we should call this option liberal and democratic only if a second option is also available to maintain a separate group life while enjoying the same civil and political rights that the majority enjoys. This is to assimilate to the state, but not to the nation, to make or to try to make oneself a permanent national minority. Nation-states with long traditions of relative homogeneity will be uncomfortable with such permanence, as the French are now, with Muslim immigrants from North Africa who do not seem as assimilable as did immigrants from Eastern Europe. That may turn out to be wrong. In fact, the existence of national minorities is common enough. If the minority is large and geographically concentrated, and if it feels unjustly subordinated or fears for the survival of its culture, it is likely to seek a state of its own through secession or partition. The logic of nation statehood supports this effort. A nation with its own state cannot rightly deny statehood to the nation that comes next. More often, however, minorities are small and dispersed and must seek other forms of protection against persecution and discrimination. The best protection is equal citizenship and the right to associate freely for cultural defense and preservation. No doubt minorities are at risk even in liberal and democratic nation-states. Their culture will not be reinforced by the state schools or by the holidays marked on the state calendar in the same way that the majority culture is reinforced. Critics of the nation-state stress this point. Bastille Day doesn't resonate with the Algerians in France or Hanukkah with Arabs in Israel. But though individuals do slip away, assimilating into the majority culture or moving uncertainly into a cultural no man's land, many minority groups have fared well in liberal democracies, sustaining their own communities while engaging as citizens in state politics. In the new competition with global commercial culture, I'm not sure that majorities fare any better. In any case, democratic nation-states rank among the most successful states in the world today. Their politics is more attractive, their rates of political participation are higher, their welfare systems are more generous than in any of the more heterogeneous structures. It's a hard question for contemporary nation-states whether these achievements can be maintained when new immigrant groups are admitted, as they must be, as they will be, to full democratic rights. So the fate of groups, large and small, will be worked out mostly within the 5 political arrangements that I've just described. It may be the case, so some people claim, that we are moving toward a world where all states will be immigrant states. But I don't think so. Most of the new states created in the years after 1989 out of the former Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia and the former Czechoslovakia are nation states. And what we might think of as the aspiring nations, Kurds and Palestinians, for example, aspire to nation statehood. At the same time, however, the rise of the European Union suggests that once national aspirations have been realized, once the state system is, so to speak, complete, a new kind of multinational federation may become possible. Given the EU's democracy deficit and its current difficulties organizing an effective response to the economic recession, I have to say that this federation is still a project, not yet a full achievement. Nonetheless, a lot has been achieved, and Europe, once a zone of war, is now a zone of peaceful coexistence. So I have a proposal for other parts of the world where regimes of coexistence are contested, as in the Middle East, say, for one example. First, draw lines on the map that separate peoples and divide territory in a way that maximizes the possibility of national self-determination. And then, only then, after that has been accomplished, try to turn those lines into dotted lines, into lines across which there is mutual engagement, as the Europeans are in the process of doing. This isn't a universal formula. I would not advocate, for example, the breakup and reconstitution of India, an imperial creation that is no longer in the hands of the imperialists. India is partly a bi-religious state where Muslims have their own millet. It's partly a multinational federation. It's partly a Hindu nation state. But the fact that it confuses my categories, that's obviously not an argument against it. Where larger units can be sustained, they should be sustained. But where oppression exists, where the aspiration for sovereignty exists, it must be met, either by full and equal citizenship or by independence. We don't, in fact, live in a post-sovereign or post-Westphalian world, as some political scientists argue, and we can't even begin to construct such a world until all the people who need citizenship or sovereignty get what they need. Thank you.